Katrina, and we are going to be talking about the buzz about bees, their importance, identification, and how to monitor them. A colleague of mine, Tori Evans, also helped me make this slideshow and teach a class with me last year at the NCAP program. This is the slides that are complementary to the bee monitoring kit that is available at the EERC through COSI. And it helps just give you a real life experience of a simplified version of monitoring that scientists actually do to see the health of bees and other organisms. So I want to ask you to just think about, what stories do you have about bees? Like, where have you seen them? What connection do you have to them? And I'll start with a story that I have, which is that bumblebees here at St. Edward State Park absolutely love thimbleberry. And I have a little video as well as an audio clip of them just playing in these flowers. You'll generally hear the bumblebees on the thimbleberries before you will ever see them. They're very loud. So, let's go a little broad and just talk about pollinator and plant relationships. So pollinators include many organisms like bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, beetles. But they also include things like hummingbirds, bats, lemurs, honey possums, even reptiles like skinks, geckos, and wall lizards. And they have been evolving together for millions of years. Their very close interactions with each other have led to increasingly specialized adaptations. This is generally called convergent evolution, and we believe that it started with insects and plants. And this is why we have such a wide diversity of plants and insects, is because of their relationships together that have allowed them to sort of branch off into these different shapes, sizes, colors, odors, and things like that. So I just kind of want to get you thinking, like, why would pollinators want flowers? And vice versa, why would plants want pollinators? And if you're doing this in the group, maybe you can turn to the person next to you and just give some ideas. Pause the video if you need a bit more time. But mostly, the idea is that insects want flowers. Pollinators want flowers because of nectar. It is a sweet carb that gives them energy, as well as they can eat the pollen for protein. Not all pollinators eat the pollen, but if they do, it is a source of protein for them. And the other way around, plants want pollinators because animal pollination is way more precise and uses less resources than wind pollination. With wind pollination, they sort of have to just produce as much pollen as possible and throw it in the air and hope that another flower of the same species catches on to it further downwind. That's why you'll see so much pollen collected on your car, or even the little wishes from the black cottonwoods around here. They use mainly wind pollination. Whereas animal pollination, they go directly from one flower to another flower. And so they don't have to make as much pollen, which allows them to use more of that energy for other plant growth, like leaf growth. We categorize pollinators into generally two categories. You have specialists and you have generalists. So specialists have a specialized relationship with a particular flower or group of flowers, whereas a generalist is just a pollinator that goes to any flower that is available. And so why do you think they would do this? Like, what are the advantages of being a specialist? What are the advantages of being a generalist? I just kind of want you to think about that. And of course, pause the video if you need more time. Generally speaking, a specialist has such a close relationship with a particular type of pollinator and flower, take like monarch butterflies and milkweeds, that they're always going to have that available to them. There's not that much competition because the two have each other. The disadvantage to that is like we're seeing declines in monarch butterflies because there's not as many milkweeds as there were before. Or say if the flowering phase changes and it's off from the time that the insects emerge, well, then they're not going to really have food sources available to them. A generalist can go to any flower that is available. The disadvantage to that is that there's a lot of competition. Everyone's going to most every flower. So then you run into the issue of possibly not having resources because there's so much competition for it. So you really do need both in an ecosystem to have that balance. Now let's look at why bees are different. 1/3 of our food actually comes from animal pollinated crops. The economic value of insect pollinated crops just in the United States in 2003, a little while ago, was between 18 and 27 billion. Now, if you were to include indirect products like alfalfa, so alfalfa bees pollinate alfalfa, which is then fed to cows, which then gives us milk, you could triple or quadruple that number. And of course, bees are built to pollinate. So unlike other pollinators, they are specifically built to pollinate. Other pollinators just happen to pollinate because they're landing on a flower. Some pollen gets dusted on them, then they land on another flower, and it might fall off. But bees are specifically built to actually carry the pollen from one flower to another. This is why they're generally considered keystone species in many ecosystems, because they're directly tied to the health of plants, and then those plants provide food and shelter for organisms up and down the food chain. Generally, this is also why they're considered indicator species, because if bee populations aren't doing very well, you can generally predict that the rest of the population in those ecosystems will also decrease. And so bees are super pollinators. So what do we mean by that? So bees are specifically designed to cross-pollinate, and in return, flowers are designed to support the life cycles of bees. So they have little pollen-carrying structures, which no other pollinator has, and these are branched hairs just on different parts of the body, depending on the family of bee. It can be on their legs, on their bellies, on their backs, and you can see in the pictures here, it's pretty evident that these hairs are very close together and branched on certain parts of their bodies, and they carry a lot of pollen. Bees also see in ultraviolet light. So this is part of what we call pollinator syndrome, and this is a collection of traits of flowers, like their shape, size, color, odor, or even the time that they bloom. And pollinator guides, or insect nectar guides. These are patterns like dots or lines or even certain colors that you can only see under ultraviolet light. And this is really apparent when you look at the picture here. You'll see, like in the flower at the top, you can't really see anything in our view, but once you have the bee's view, there's this bright red concentrated circle in the middle that's telling the bees directly where to go to get pollen and nectar. And on the flower on the bottom, you can see that ring, that bright ring of like purplish color to them. And this is what allows them to be so efficient at finding nectar and pollen. And to understand that a little bit more, let's look at the reproductive organs of a flower. This diagram is a complete and perfect flower. Not all flowers have this, but it just means that it contains both female and male parts and all parts of the flower. The female part of the flower is the dotted line there, the carpel, and the male part is the solid rectangle you can see, which is the stamen. In order for flowers to reproduce, pollen needs to be taken from the anther, which is the top of the stamen, and it needs to be placed on the stigma, which is the top of the carpel, from another flower in order to reproduce. And this is what allows the ovules to start producing seeds. So now let's look back at bees and see the difference between honeybees and native bees. Because yes, they are different. So honeybees are one species of bee called Apis mellifera. They were introduced from Europe and they are non-native. They live in large colonies and are perennial, meaning they live more than 1 year. So this is kind of a hard question, but you can take a wild guess here. Just why do you think that honeybees make honey while most other bees don't? And you can pause the video if you need more time. Maybe turn to the person next to you if you are working in a group. But largely the answer comes with this little next bit here, which is that native bees are solitary and they are annual. So this means they don't make honey. So native bees generally only live 1 year and they have no need to make honey because they don't need to overwinter. Because honeybee queens live more than 1 year, they need food resources available to them in winter when there's nothing flowering and it's too cold for them to go outside. The exception here is that bumblebees, which are native here, do make a little bit of honey. You can see in the typical life cycle of a bumblebee there. They produce small amounts of honey, and this is largely just to feed more bees because they do live in colonies. So honeybees and bumblebees are the only ones that live in colonies. Bumblebees live in small colonies and nest in the ground, and they do still die after a year. Most bees are solitary and ground nesting, so they do not live in hives. They create individual nest chambers that they produce an egg in and that they get food provisions for. And those bees generally pupate or overwinter during the winter, and they emerge in spring to fly around and repeat the process again. This kind of helps you understand why bees are on, generally as a whole, the decline. Honeybees are generally declining due to colony collapse disorder. This is where worker bees leave the nest and don't come back. They don't really know why this is happening. They suspect it might be sustained neurological issues from pesticides, but they're not entirely sure. Parasites and diseases like varroa mites can wipe out entire populations of bees since it is only one species. And of course, pesticides, they kill everything. Native bees are also on the decline due to pesticides. Even ones labeled bee safe, they're finding are not very safe. Habitat loss due to urbanization and deforestation. This is largely due to the lack of nesting materials. We're not really leaving sticks or exposed dirt behind for them to be able to nest into. Mulched lawns, and of course not leaving sticks or twigs, and lack of usable flowers. A lot of flowers that we tend to plant in landscapes are ornamental flowers, so they look pretty to us. But because we have bred them to be such pretty colors, we've sort of bred out their usefulness. They don't produce as much pollen or as much nectar as normal flowers would. And large blooming gaps. We tend to plant flowers that only bloom in spring. And then there are large distances of time where there's just no flowers blooming available for the bees to eat. So now let's look at the difference between a bee, a wasp, and a fly. So the black and yellow stripe patterning is not unique to bees. Many insects have it. And bees and wasps specifically look pretty similar because they're actually very closely related. Bees evolved from wasps to be herbivorous instead of carnivorous. And flies actually mimic the colors of wasps specifically to scare predators, to make them think that they have stingers and that they're aggressive. Or sometimes they'll actually mimic the look of a bee in order to infiltrate the nest and lay their own eggs so that those bees take care of their eggs and the fly doesn't have to. These are parasitic flies. Now, looking at more of the difference, the biggest giveaway for a wasp is going to be a very constricted waist, like super teeny. And of course, they don't have any pollen carrying structures. So they might have some hair or some light dustings of pollen, but they're not going to have a lot of pollen on them. Flies, the biggest giveaway are tiny little antennae, just like super stubby that you can't really see, and huge eyes that are located like on the top of their head. And they're usually more rounded and not constricted. And bees look very similar to wasps, and sometimes they can even look similar to flies. They can range from having really long shapes with pinched waists to very rounded shapes. The biggest giveaway for a bee is going to be pollen carrying structures, called corbicula or scopula based on the type of bee. And this is generally those branched hairs that you see and like a ton of pollen on the bee. And if you wanted to, now you could play the little bee, wasp, and fly game. Just keeping in mind the tips that I gave you, so you can try and spot the difference. But some look very similar and you might be surprised. It's a little harder than we would think. So it's important to know if you're looking at a bee in order to monitor them. That's why knowing the difference between a bee, a wasp, and a fly is very helpful. And there are a couple organizations that do bee monitoring. We do have the CCUW Bee Monitoring Program on the University of Washington Bothel's campus. This is also partnered with Cascadia College and the sustainability coordinators. And students run these monitoring surveys and work with the grounds crew in order to develop this relationship between students saying, this is how bees are doing, whether they're doing okay, are certain types of groups doing okay, and then the grounds crew being able to then implement the changes needed to increase those populations. Like if there are noticeable blooming gaps, to plant flowers that bloom in those gaps, so there's no longer there. Or leaving exposed dirt and not mulching as often, things like that. There's also the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation. This is an international nonprofit organization that monitors bees. They categorize bees into morphogroups, and it is actually an adaptation of their monitoring protocol that we have for this bee monitoring kit. Knowing the morphological characteristics tells you a lot about how a bee lives and forages, which is why it's great for citizen monitoring programs, because you don't need to have a lot of schooling in order to be able to tell the different species. You can tell a lot just by the shapes that the bees are. This is what the data sheet looks like. This is an example of the simplified version. So you'll go through and fill out the site details, like the weather and the type of flower you're focusing on, and it has the instructions, of course, for it. This one specifically focuses on just bee, wasp, and fly, but the detailed version actually shows you the different morpho groups that you would tick for every one you saw. So how can you help pollinators? The biggest thing really is trying to plant more native or functional flowers in your own garden if it's possible for you. Even having little planters on balconies on apartments has been shown to attract bees versus just ornamental. So this is like just the pretty flowers. Generally, if you go to your local nursery, you can ask the people there and they'll generally know, is this an ornamental flower or is this a native or functional flower? Trying to lessen blooming gaps, so trying to have flowers that bloom at different times of the year so that you're not left with a time that there's no flowers blooming. This is great for us too because it's more beautiful flowers to look at throughout the year. Trying not to use as many top dressings like mulch, leaving open soil so that bees can actually nest in that ground, and having it undisturbed So this means to try and mow less, to try and walk over it less. You can even just designate certain wild areas of your garden, maybe areas that are behind things that you don't really need to mow, nobody really sees. This is a great place for bees to nest. Trying to have like leaves, mud, sticks, just available in your garden somewhere. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but again, just like in that wild area, you could leave. Because some bees nest in little holes in sticks. Some bees use mud to make their nests, and some bees use sticks and that sort of thing, or nest underneath leaves in the fall. Mason bee houses you can also supply. This just gives them somewhere artificially that they can lay their little nesting chambers, like you could see in the picture that we have on campus. We have quite a few, 4 or 5 I believe on campus. Mason bees are only active from like early March to May, and they only fly for a couple months. They make these nesting chambers and they just grow for the rest of the year. And trying to have your flowers closer together in what's called clusters or patches is really helpful, because some bees are super small, like smaller than the size of your fingernail, and they can't fly very far between their nest and flowering resources, sometimes fewer than a few feet. Whereas bigger bees can fly much farther. Like honeybees can fly a mile away from their hives in either direction, but many bees can only go a few feet. And if you were wanting to do the detailed version, this is where I will sort of talk about the different types of morpho groups and how to identify them. If you're just doing the simplified version, feel free to skip ahead. The first one for morpho groups is honeybees. They are like very torpedo shaped and very golden in color. They usually have like a tritoned stripe and a darker sort of top half and head. They do have pollen baskets, which are called corbicula. So this means if you see a big basket of pollen on the sides of their legs, it's a good chance it's either a honeybee or a bumblebee. They're the only two that have it. They do live in hives with a lot of workers and one queen. And then we have bumblebees. You've probably seen these around here. They're very big. They can be super big, but the workers are generally a bit smaller than you would think. They're super fuzzy and round. They come in a variety of colors and patterns. And they also are the only ones that have pollen baskets, or corbicula. They live in colonies smaller than honeybees with one queen. And then you have medium dark bees. This encompasses quite a few families of bees, and they can range from 7 to 18 millimeters, pretty small to a little bit bigger. They can be like narrow and tubular shaped or a little more robust and rounded. They generally have a fuzzy head and thorax, which is the middle part, and they're usually dark colors, hence the name. They have scopa, which are not the baskets, but rather just hairs on their underside of their thorax, which carry the pollen. And they are solitary bees. You have green metallic bees. If you see these guys, you'll generally know they're super bright, beautiful. And they are narrow-shaped, 9 to 11 millimeters, so slightly bigger. They have a fuzzy head and thorax, and usually they're super bright green with possibly a striped abdomen. Sometimes in the shade it's hard to see the green because it's not reflected. It's a very metallic shade, but if you get close enough, you can generally start to really see that metallic shine. And they of course have scopa. They have all those hairs on the hind legs, as you can see in the picture at the bottom, and that's what carries the pollen, and they're solitary. Then we have tiny dark bees. These ones are very small. They're 4 to 8 millimeters. Sometimes they can be hard to see, and they can even look like flying ants. They're usually narrow-shaped. They can have really sparse hair, like you see on the picture on the bottom here. You barely see hair. They're dark in color, and they have scopa, which is pollen on the hind legs. They are also solitary. In the other picture with this bee on this yellow flower, this is like a dandelion shaped. This bee is very small, and sometimes they can be hard to find. But if you sit down, you'll usually start to see them come out on like small flowers that are close to the ground. And then we have metallic hairy belly bees. Now these are your mason bees. And you'll generally only see these guys between maybe late February to late May if you're really stretching their season. And they have a very metallic color. As you can see, usually it's blue, but sometimes it's green. And again, sometimes in the shade, it's very hard to see it. But in full sun, you'll generally see the little shine coming out here. Now they're a robust shape instead of narrow. And they are usually fuzzy all over with no stripes. And they carry their pollen on their belly. So that's where you see, like on the picture up there, there's a ton of yellow pollen all over this mason bee's belly. And they are solitary. And they nest in holes in trees or sticks or, of course, mason bee houses. So that is everything you need to know in order to do your bee monitoring. Thank you for being interested. And if you want to know events and things that are coming up, you can sign up for COSI's newsletter. I hope you have fun.